please let me know, because I'm more than happy to play and adjust. Family histories are things that I've probably taken well over 1,000 family histories during the course of my career. And so I think I'm probably pretty comfortable with changing, but I am going to talk a little bit about adding health to your family history. Questions to ask about the living and about the deceased. I'm not going to tell you how to talk to the deceased. This isn't a seance practice here. But who to ask. When you're asking family history questions, there's different information that you'll get from different people. And then once you've got that information, how do you talk to your healthcare providers? Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some ethical and privacy issues before I end with some resources that you all can take away from this. So you've heard a little bit about me. What I'd like to do is have you tell me a little bit about you. Paige was way gracious in helping me try to figure out how to make these into real polls, and the two of us couldn't make it work. So use your chat box. This is where you get to pull up the little chat part in your page. And 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Who's the genealogist in your family? Mostly, I'm interested to find out numbers 4 and 5. If everybody has a family history subscription to Ancestry.com, that's going to be a different presentation than if none of you know what a genealogist is. So, Paige, take it away. Let me know what people are writing in there.
All right, so in your chat, go ahead and you can just put in the number 1, 2, 3, or 4. I put in number 1. Well, no, I meant to put in number 2, because my mom, who's also on this call, she's the one who knows about the family.
Oh,
yep.
Okay.
So let's see.
So there should be a number 1 as well then, right?
Yeah, Mom should put number
Joan?
1 and say that she that's okay. Anybody else want to put anything in the chat? If you know how, here we go. Suzanne says that they have a subscription to Ancestry.
Cool.
And that's okay. Don't stress yourself out over that. About if you can't do the chat, don't worry about it. We got another. We got a number 1. I am and proud of it.
Cool. Good. Okay. Well, this is clearly one of the many places. This is not the only place where people do genealogy, but this is Salt Lake City is a hub for where family histories happen. I am a member of a number of genetic organizations as a geneticist, and many of our meetings are here. I cannot tell you the number of people who have stayed like the week before or the week after so they can do genealogy work. And so genealogy basically is just collecting family history information. And this is an example of a family from Utah. Actually, it's a Google search picture, but this is not unusual. When I first came to Utah, I actually came to Utah because of this kind of event. I was recruited here to work with a company that was in the process of discovering genes that would predispose to cancer. And this is not atypical. I spent my first 2 summers here going to family reunions to a place where I would not go to a family reunion unless the food was good and they promised me that the food would be good, because it was crazy. We were in the process of doing research 30 years ago, and there would be 6 people. We'd have 6 different tables. Mom and Dad would be at the front of the table, and then all the kids and grandkids behind them. And we had a team of individuals. Our principal investigator, our PI, would stand up on one of the tables in the very beginning, and he would tell a little bit about the research. Informed consent was crazy different back then, let me tell you, not nearly as rigorous as it is today. But then basically people would line up at the tables behind, and we would be drawing blood and taking family histories for craziness. It was interesting. I remember one day I was doing this. I'm like, Susan, not that person. That's a boyfriend. He just came along for the ride. So we had to be really careful about making sure we had biologic people in there. But this is not unusual for what we were doing in some of the early days. I think one of the pieces that was very interesting about the family histories that I was able to take is that ultimately I was able to give back information. And I was one of the first 3 genetic counselors here in Utah who was giving genetic information back to a family that actually helped characterize some of the breast cancer genes. Ultimately, I probably saw close to 750 people in one family. So those were interesting days back then. But most genealogy actually doesn't happen at well, some of it does happen at family reunions, but this is a place where a lot of family history happens. And for some of you who may know this particular place, this is the Family History Library, downtown Salt Lake City. Basically, genealogy is the study of families, family histories, and tracing your lineage in. And it's collected in a variety of ways. A lot of it typically is oral history. You often talk to uncles, aunts, grandparents, get information about who in the family knows. And it's really about defining relationships. But historical records can be very, very useful as well. Those of you who are in genealogy might be excited because last week, actually last Friday, the 1950 census records were released. I bet you guys didn't know that. But as a genealogist, that's kind of exciting information because those were the first census records in the United States that came out after the war. And there was a lot of information there that is going to link when men came home, where they landed, where they ended up, who were they married to. There were a lot of wartime marriages. And the 1950 census records are ones that I think people have been very excited and waiting to get. But they're released usually, 70 years. They're held, they're curated, and then they're released. And they were actually just released last Friday. So there's a lot of people who do genealogy work who are very busy this week. And that's probably why they're not on this call, because they're all busy doing their genealogy work. But there's a lot of interest in genealogy. I think there's been a lot of television shows that have shown the value and the importance of genealogy work. And one of the things that has sort of sprung up in the last number of years is that there are professional genealogists here in the country. Clearly, if anybody, and you don't have to be a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, anybody can go to the Family History Library downtown. The people, well, I haven't been since pre-pandemic, but the people there are amazingly wonderful and helpful. So if anybody, that would be a field trip that I would highly recommend anytime, if you, even if you're not interested in your own, family history collection, that is a Salt Lake field trip that I would recommend to anybody. But what I want to talk today is I want to talk about adding health information to the genealogy, to the relationship information, because for most people, genealogy is really about sort of the name, the date of birth, the marriage date, the date of death, who they're married to, who the children are, what the relationships are. A lot of times it also does include information about where people lived, where they moved. Rarely does it include health information. And I'm here to advocate that health information, especially if you can get it now on the older generations, can be really, really valuable. It can be clinically relevant from before a baby is born in the prenatal arena, from cradle all the way to grave. And there's really, I think anybody who's probably been to a doctor, a new doctor, or even updated doctors, a lot of times when you go to your doctor's appointment, family history information is now included on a lot of the intakes. And there's often a little chart that has, mother, father, sisters, brothers, or it has a list of condition. Does anybody in your family have any blah, 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 blah. And if you click yes, then you can go over and click who has it. There are different questions for different clinical concerns. So there's the information that a provider will collect at the very beginning of an appointment, but then there's also the information that becomes important once you have clinical issues. So in the prenatal and pediatrics clinics, the genetic information is a little bit different. In a prenatal diagnosis clinic, you could, more and more women are getting what they're calling maternal serum screening, which is essentially a blood draw. That particular blood draw now, depending on the company you go with, can test anywhere from probably 40 to 400 different conditions. the vast majority of those 400 different conditions are incredibly rare, very unusual. The chances of a baby having that condition are something like, 1 in 50,000 kind of thing. But it's fun for a company to say, we can test for 400 different genetic conditions. And then you pay another extra amount of money that you really don't need to pay in the first place. But that's another story for another time. But it's becoming more common. And one of the things that often comes with the maternal serum screening is lack of informed consent, because women don't really know what they're getting into when they stick out their arm to have the blood drawn. And the other part of the problem is that it often is framed as, do you want to know if your baby is going to be healthy? And that's specious, because it tells you a lot of things, but it doesn't tell you everything. One of the things it does tell you is the gender, if the baby's going to be biological boy or biological girl. And so a lot of people sort of see that as, oh, I'm going to get that blood test to find out the sex of my baby. Back in the days, we waited 9 months. It didn't change. It was still the same. I was like, okay. But there are people who go into a prenatal diagnosis clinic because they're worried about, I have a family history of, my sister has cystic fibrosis, my uncle has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, I have a genetic condition that runs in my family. What's the chance my baby would get it? And clearly in those arenas, genetic counselors often very able to collect a family history, verify medical records, and provide some information. So there is a place. Also, if a maternal serum screen is abnormal or if an ultrasound is abnormal, those are also places where genetic counselor can sometimes get involved and provide, family history sometimes will be helpful. In a pediatrics clinic, family history can be useful. Typically, genetics happens around newborn screening when kids get heel sticks a couple of days after they are born, or if there's a sick child or a child who does have a physical or internal birth defect, a heart disease, something like that. And a lot of times the family history at that point will help. I mean, sometimes a baby, sort of a classic example is that a baby can be in an ICU and be very floppy. Well, that in and of itself may not be a big problem, except if you take a really clear family history, that can maybe show that, oh, wait a minute, there's a family history of a muscle disorder here that really everybody else was mild, and now we have a baby who's got a serious muscle disorder. So sometimes family history can help in those circumstances. But what I really wanted to focus on today is sort of the adult world. But first I need to tell everybody about the genetic terms, because I would lose my genetic counseling license if I didn't try to overeducate you here. And this is just a little bit of genetic information. I promise only one slide, but I am going to pause after this to make sure that if there's any questions, we can take a minute to make sure that you're all kind of clear on that. So the two words that I'm going to focus on today are the words chromosomes and genes. Chromosomes are the packages of the genetic material. This is a picture of chromosomes right here. Paige, when I do this, can you see it? Or
I can. I can see your cursor.
Okay. Yeah.
Some people can, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I don't want to be annoying, but these are chromosomes. These are pictures. We've got 46 in a typical human being, different numbers for different species, but there are 22 of what we call autosomes, and they're numbered very handy for you, number 1 through 22. The number 1s are the longest, the number 2s are the shortest. Typically, we all have 2 copies of all of these. These are these chromosomes are the things that if you for instance had Down syndrome, you would end up with 3 chromosome number 21s. So 3 chromosome 21s is going to be the child who has Down syndrome. Okay. Typically, if you had that much extra genetic material, say for instance, one of the most common reasons for miscarriages is an extra chromosome 16. So having 3 chromosome 16s is basically incompatible with life. Those pregnancies usually miscarry often like between weeks 10 and 14, because you've just got too much and it just doesn't make sense to the developing fetus. Sometimes babies with extra chromosome 13 or 18 can in fact be born. Many of those children have very, very short lives, although some of them can live a little bit longer. But those really are the only the three chromosomes that are compatible with life if there's a whole extra one. Most of the things that I'm going to talk about are the genes that are contained on the chromosome. So while we only have 46 chromosomes, we've got 3,000 genes. So those genes are all shoveled onto these chromosomes and we can't see them. The other chromosomes here, this is an X and a Y chromosome. Females have two X chromosomes, males have one X and one Y. That's going to be important in one moment when I talk about the genes, because the genes really are the inheritance packages. You can inherit something in what we call an autosomal dominant. So these are autosomes. So if you ignore this sex chromosome thing right here, if you've got genes on any of the other 22 chromosomes, it can either be what we call a dominant gene or a recessive gene. A dominant gene says, you can see we've got pairs of all these things. So if I've got two genes, a dominant gene is going to be the one that's stronger than the other one. So if I've got an alteration or a mutation, if I've got a change in a dominant gene, then that one is going to show up as a genetic condition, a genetic problem, because that other gene can't compensate. And when we have these 46 chromosomes in every single cell in our body with one exception. When we go to make eggs, when we go to make sperms, to make babies, we divide all that genetic material in half. So when you're making baby number one, you give that baby number one 23 chromosomes, and that other 23 comes from the partner. When you make baby number two, it's a whole new story. Doesn't matter what happened the first time, it's all brand new right now. 23 from mom, 23 from dad, a whole combination. Now, if you have an autosomal dominant genetic condition, those genes pass from generation to generation and often will show up. There's a 1 in 4 or 1 in 2 chance with every pregnancy that that genetic condition would be passed along. In autosomal recessive situations, you have to have both mom and dad have that same altered piece of genetic material, and you only get that condition 1 in every 4 chance. Those are a lot of those newborn screening, the metabolic conditions that I talked about are often recessive. X-linked are only genes that are located on these X and Y, on the X and Y chromosomes, primarily on the Y chromosome, because you don't have necessarily a pair on an X chromosome. So if a woman has a genetic alteration, she's got a second X chromosome that's stronger that doesn't make the problem show up. But if a male has a problem on his X chromosome, that Y chromosome may not have compatible genetic material, so you would have a problem show up. So these are kind of the ways in which we see genetic traits happening from generation to generation. But the final one is the one that we see mostly in adult scenarios, and it's called multifactorial. Multifactorial is pretty much the garbage bucket term that geneticists use to mean it's a combination of genetic issues and all sorts of other things. So a multifactorial condition is a condition that might have a genetic predisposition, but all that stuff that Paige talks about all the time in terms of healthy eating, healthy movement, good health habits, not smoking, those kinds of things will ultimately sometimes impact how your genes manifest, especially in the adult world. So I'm going to shut up for a moment, because if anybody has any questions about this is stuff that, in class we spend like 3 weeks teaching. And so I gave you the really quick and dirty overview. But if I've thoroughly confused anybody and they want me to explain something differently, I can do that. Otherwise, and you can either, I think, unmute or put something in the chat, and I'll give you a minute.
Yep, you're welcome to unmute or put something in the chat if you have questions. And if not, that is okay as well, and Vicki will just move along.
Okay. I will. So here's the collecting health history part of the family history. So collecting family health history. So what can run in families? Well, basically almost anything can run in families, pretty much except broken bones, really trauma. And sometimes trauma can be exacerbated by genetic conditions. But the other side of it is that we don't just inherit genes from our mom and dad, we also inherit lifestyles. We do inherit recipes. We do inherit behaviors. Um, what I want to focus on today is not so much the recipes and the behaviors, but the genetic information that gets collected from mom and dad. And there, I mean, some of it's sort of the fun stuff. Suzanne, I think you made a comment about having the family subscription to Ancestry.com. And as part of that, you probably get some information about traits, things like, can you roll your tongue? Let me demonstrate. Okay, that was fun. Being able to roll your tongue turns out to be an inherited condition. If you can roll your tongue, it's very likely that one of your parents can roll your tongue. The reality is, as 40 years as a genetic counselor, I never saw anybody clinically because they could not roll their tongue. It turns out not to really be important. You can live a very fulfilling life without being able to roll your tongue or have your ears be connected. I mean, there's all sorts of traits that can run in families that we see. What I want to focus on today are those that I'm going to call clinically relevant, the ones that can potentially make you sick. And it turns out this is where that multifactorial word comes in handy. Because in any one condition, if you're talking about cancer, if you're talking about heart disease, if you're talking about muscle disorders, about 30% of individuals with that with a cancer, and I'm going to use breast cancer as an example because that's where I spent 15, 20 years of my life. About if you looked at everybody at Huntsman Cancer Institute who walks in the door with a breast cancer, about 30% of those individuals will have what we call a positive family history. And what that means is that there's somebody else in their family who also has a breast cancer. That doesn't necessarily mean it's genetic. What that means is that breast cancer is common. And sometimes two people in a family can have breast cancer. About 5 to 10% of people who have a breast cancer will have it as a result of an inherited genetic mutation that does run in a family. So you see that difference there? And it's the same thing if you're talking about prostate cancer, if you're talking about colon cancer, if you're talking about high blood pressure, if you're talking about Alzheimer's, all of those kinds of things. The vast majority of them, about 30% of individuals with those conditions, it runs in the family. When you look at things like allergies and asthma, some of that certainly could be the lifestyle, where people live. And so it's not just that you've inherited genes that predispose you, but it also means that you're exposed to an environmental insult, as it were. Okay. So what do we do about this? Well, if there's a particular, so you can collect family history, health history in two ways. One, you can look very generically. And so you can, and this is actually from a reference that I'm going to give you later on in the presentation. But this is a very generic and easy to collect piece of information that says, here's the family member's name, here's that relationship to me, and then you can just go through a set of problems: heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, asthma, osteoporosis, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, depression, mental health, or other. Now you can see it also asks, does this family smoke? And is this family member deceased? And if so, what was the age of death and what was the cause of death? And so if you write down, Uncle Steve died of lung cancer and he was a 2-pack a day smoker, that would be a lifestyle or environmental factor related to this individual. Or you could say he worked in an asbestos mine, or you could say he worked at a nuclear power plant, you know, or a coal miner. I mean, there's certainly a lot of lifestyle and environmental factors that can impact somebody's health. So having that information can be really useful. The other piece that's very useful was how old was this person when the disease happened? Because quite frankly, we don't get out of this game alive, okay? I'm sure that this is not news to anybody on this call, but we're all gonna die. Ideally, we die at relatively long ages with relatively good life and health until very close to the time we die. However, there are clearly people who, for reasons that aren't always clear, will acquire a disease at an early age. It used to be that we never started screening for colon cancer until people were 50. And now we're starting to screen for colon cancer at age 40. Why is that? Well, there's probably some environmental issues that we're not really clear about, but people seem to be developing colon cancer earlier. And quite frankly, colon cancer screening is getting less expensive and it's getting better than it was. I mean, back in the day, really the choice was colonoscopy, which was pretty invasive. Now there's other options. And people are screening earlier because if you find colon cancer at an earlier age, or if you find polyps, certainly, you can take them out. And polyps will develop cancer in some petri dish, someplace lab. That's fine, as long as it doesn't develop cancer in your body. So there are certainly things that are getting better with time, but there's potentially also environmental issues that we don't fully understand. And knowing an age of onset can be important because cancer is a disease of aging. So having an aunt who developed cancer at 71 is very different from having an aunt who developed a breast cancer at age 32 or an ovarian cancer at age 38 or 42. Those typically are cancers that happen to people after they're 55. So that's one of the reasons, if we look at early age of onset, that's often a clue as to whether or not something might be inherited. Okay. So who do you ask this information of? Quite frankly, who's most approachable? If Uncle Steve is cranky, you know what? Don't ask him. Maybe ask his wife. What's really interesting, though, is that we did a study. Oh, heavens, this must have been now, this might have been 30 years ago when we were first starting to, when I was first starting to look at the world of breast cancer at the time. And we basically did a study to look at how well people reported their family histories. And so what we did was we looked at and this was breast cancer, ovarian cancer, colon cancer, and prostate cancer. And skin cancer. Okay, there were 5. I knew there were 5. So what we did was we started out with the medical records. Then we went to what we call the cancer registry, because in the state of Utah, there is a cancer registry. Anybody who gets cancer in the state of Utah, their cancer is put into that registry. Then we asked the person who was affected, himself or herself, and then we asked that person to name 3 individuals who they thought would be willing to talk to us and who knew about the cancer. So we weren't going to go to some strange or some family member and say, oh, did you know about so-and-so's cancer? We were going to people who this person had said it's okay to talk to them. And it was fascinating. When we talked to individuals who Uncle John said, you can talk to Sue because she knows about my cancer, and how often Sue got information wrong. And it was not so wrong with breast cancer. Breast cancer is pretty common and people were pretty open about it. But colon cancer, prostate cancer, and certainly ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer kind of oh, she had one of those female cancers, whatever that is. But female cancer was a very common thing that we would get on family histories. So how do you ask these questions? You ask them gently. And you often try to give them a rationale. Why am I asking this? I'm not asking this vicariously because I'm nosy. I'm asking it because I want to improve the health of the family for the kids and the grandchildren. It's also, so one of the other things that happened while I was at Huntsman is that the Surgeon General with the CDC proclaimed November as like family health history collection month. And there was this big push to sort of like ask questions over Thanksgiving dinner when the families were all together. And I just can imagine these conversations. Sue, would you pass the potatoes? And oh, by the way, how are those polyps? It's like, at what point do you ask this information? And Thanksgiving dinner is probably not necessarily the time or place, but we used to have a fun time kind of thinking about how those family questions were collected at that time. But you can ask individually, privately, you can sort of say, I just took a class, I just got this really I read an interesting article, I'm kind of curious, would you be willing to talk to me about it? And get what you can and don't push on what you can't get, because sometimes people are quiet for a reason. So let me see here. Oops. Okay. So this is really the kind of information, again, cancer, what's the kind of information, what is the condition? And try to get as specific as you can. I kind of laughed already about the female cancer. When was it first diagnosed? Was it early onset? And it doesn't matter if they were 38 or 39. The number of times that I have taken family histories and it's like, what, we remember when we went to the wedding and it was like the month after the wedding and oh, but it was before Steve was born. So I think she was like 40, that doesn't matter. Approximate. I need to know if it was in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, not that she was 32 and a half. So age of onset is useful. Current age, that should be easy, or age at time of death. And the other thing in the cancer world is what type of screening actually happened. The number of times people have said in the world of cancer is they opened her up and she was full of cancer, so they closed her again. What that means is that we don't know where the cancer happened. By the time we figured it out, it had spread the whole body. But we also say, yeah, and he never had a colonoscopy in his life. So things like that can be useful. And then we want to get this information of what we call first and second degree relatives on both the mom and the dad's side. So if somebody had prostate cancer, you don't just ask the boys, you ask everybody about the cancers in the family. If it was just the number of times, and hopefully this has changed by now, but even 5 years ago, I saw family history forms that sort of looked at breast cancer and it's like, well, it was on your father's side, but it's your father's side. So it didn't get genetic material from your dad. If we're thinking about family histories, both mom and dad come to the table equally. So look at that one. Now, this is just a graphic family history, so I can show you sort of who first and second degree relatives are. So let's say this round, so girls are round and curvy, men are squares. Okay, I might get called on the carpet for that one page. I'll take it. But this is the way family histories work, okay? So if this is me, my first degree family members are going to be my parents, my father and my mother, my children, who would be my son and my daughter, and then my siblings, my brother, my sister, my brother. So those are first degree relatives. This is my spouse. My spouse is not biologically related to me. My spouse is biologically related. Well, hopefully my spouse is not biologically related to me. But my spouse is biologically related to the children. So if the children are taking a family history, then dad and all of his family members count. Okay. A second degree family member is right here. This would be a niece. Nieces, nephews, grandparents, grandchildren. They are second degree. And quite frankly, first and second degree family members are probably what you need to get in terms of pushing it out. If there's family history of cancer like this one, then you can start expanding it. But this kind of a family history taken to your doctor should get you an appointment with a genetic counselor. And if it doesn't, call Paige, Paige will call me, and I will make arrangements to get you into a genetic counselor. So, but all of this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's also a lot of ethical and social concerns. And people do ask, well, what if I'm adopted? I don't have a family history. And this is one of the reasons that people certainly talk about open adoptions or open record adoptions, because they are interested in what does the family history look like. And that can be overlaid with a whole lot of social issues in terms of why was I adopted? And sometimes it's really hard to separate those two things out. I think for people who are adopted, what I often do is I go back to the fact that you have to remember that in any one sort of circumstance, 30% of individuals with that health scenario have a positive family history, and only 5 to 10% is it inherited. So there's a huge number of lifestyle options there that can really help. And for folks who are adopted, I would personally send them to Paige so she could teach them how to have the healthiest lifestyle possible. Because that's what you can do. That's what we all can do, regardless of our family histories and our social. What it does is it sometimes lets us know if there is something running in the family, maybe we start looking at some kind of screening a little earlier. So if there is a genetic predisposition to, say, colon cancer, you may end up starting your colon cancer screening at 35 rather than 45 or 50. Or you start your mammograms earlier. If it's blood pressure that maybe runs in your family, a lot of that is going to get picked up in your healthcare visit. And so you can monitor that without knowing your family history. The other piece for a lot of people who are adopted is many of them will in fact try to go to some of the companies that offer sort of genome screening. And that gives you a little bit of information, but surprisingly not as much as people usually want. So another ethical concern has to do with twins. And there's two ways in which that falls out. If you're a fraternal twin, that's basically like being a sibling. So being a sibling, brother or sister, that's no issue. Identical twins sometimes can create more of an issue because identical twins, for all intents and purposes, will have the vast majority of their genetic material is the same. So if identical twin 1 wants to get some kind of a genetic test, the result of that test will in fact be relevant to identical twin number 2. And if identical twin number 2 doesn't want the information, then that can create issues. And I've certainly counseled significantly with families where that becomes an issue. The reality is that your family history is the same for both of them. The issue there is what happens with respect to how you use that information. Finally, as it relates to family history, what if my family is really private about their health information? And again, we've all heard both of these things. Ignorance is bliss and knowledge is power. And people can come at these philosophies. And sometimes people will say, well, usually I'm a big believer in knowledge is power. But there are places where, I'm one of those people who ignorance is bliss when it comes to whatever is under the hood of my car engine. I periodically, if I hear a noise, I'm the person who just turns up the volume on the radio. And then when it gets louder than the radio, then I bring it to the mechanic. I am very much an ignorance is bliss kind of person in that world. For the most part, I believe knowledge is power, but not everybody does. And quite frankly, I started working in the cancer world 30-ish, 25, 20 years ago. There were still people in our clinics who said the C word. They didn't even use the word cancer because they were so afraid of that. And there were people who, when a grandparent was diagnosed with a cancer, would come out and talk to the doctors like, we don't want mom to know that that's what she has. And that really that conflicts with a lot of the value system that you often see in the Western medical model. And that became problematic for people. And we find that certainly in talking about family histories, where there are people who just don't talk about their personal health history. And we have to accept that and move on. And then be as healthy as you can in those other worlds. Even with that, you can talk to your healthcare provider. Sometimes you collect information if there's an unusual lab result. If you've got high cholesterol, and then you start asking, anybody else in the family have high cholesterol? Or anybody else in the family have colon polyps? Or sometimes you find out that, Jennifer ended up with breast cancer at 23. And then that news spreads to the family. And now you start, oh yeah, well, didn't you know that, her cousin or her third cousin once removed also? There's that whole family has a lot of cancer, and her father had prostate cancer. Now you start putting that together. So often there are trigger points when you talk to your healthcare provider that will allow you to collect information. And from a genetic counseling perspective, a lot of that was if we found somebody in a clinic who had a genetic alteration, a genetic mutation that increased a risk significantly of developing breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, or whatever it was, then from our perspective, we worked very hard to encourage that person to talk to. And we would. I would often say, who's the genealogist in your family? And do I have your permission? Would you give me? Can I give you this letter to send to this person to call me so we can get this information out to your family? And that was something that we would try. I can't ethically cold call. I have a responsibility to your privacy. So I can't go calling or running into people in the supermarket saying, oh, hey, did you hear about? And it is an interesting issue because certainly here in Utah, when we worked with large families, many members of those families lived in smaller communities. And that information did get shared in those communities, which was sometimes pretty uncomfortable. And we tried to rein in those sort of ethical. One of my women who I adored her. And I finally had to say, you got to quit bringing this up at everybody's wedding because they don't want to be hearing this. They don't want to hear that there's a genetic mutation at all the weddings and all the funerals. She's like, but they need to go. And it's like, that's your bias. We've told them. You tell them once, you tell them twice, and then you back away and let them live their lives. But talking to your healthcare provider and making that decision. I think genetic testing can be done in a clinical setting. And we've talked an awful lot today about the role of family history and how useful it can be. A lot of times that information can be done with your doctor. If there's additional questions or concerned, I'm a genetic counselor by profession. So I am going to encourage that you ask your doctor to be able to see a genetic counselor because a genetic counselor can talk about, all of the nuances. If you think I'm overeducating you today, oh my gosh, sit down with a genetic counselor for an hour and a half. They can really overeducate you. But there are other resources that you don't have to go to a clinician. And if anybody is interested, these are some of the links to some of the resources. If you would let Paige know, then Paige can get them out to you. She's got these resources and I can get them to her as links as well. So if anybody would like them, please let us know. And because I know that these kinds of putting it up here doesn't always get you to the actual link, but I can get those to you. So, well, thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate that. So that's basically it. This is the slide of the question that says, if you've got any questions, I am more than happy to continue over educating you, or some of you can maybe say, okay, this was plenty. Thank you very much. So there you go. That's my story and I'm sticking to it.